was just very safe. You could bring up your children and not think twice about somebody hurting them.
She was a summer resident of Ogunquit.
Anybody could ride a bike or go to the beach and not fear anything.
I know that the area was on edge, and it was a frenzy of activity around here looking for this girl when she disappeared. This was the start of madness.
As the 1970s began, Ogunquit was a quiet little town on the coast of southern Maine. Being a popular tourist destination during the summer months meant hundreds of people would visit the area every year.
There were a lot of children, a lot more than there are now, a lot of more families. And people were more, I think, maybe more neighborly.
Of course, neighbor looked out for neighbor and so forth, and it was just a nice community.
I think Ogunquit felt safer. You could let your kids go down the street and not worry.
Everybody knew everybody else. All us kids, what we would do, we'd come home from school. All the parents would say, okay, go out and play. So you change your clothes, you go out and play. You would be outside until dinner time. During that time frame, we were in our neighborhoods, but our parents didn't know where we were.
All that began to change when Mary Catherine Olenchuk, the daughter of a military general, disappeared.
She was apparently on the beach with her mother and her older sister Jane. Apparently she left the beach to return home and went, I believe, into Ogunquit Square to do an errand. On her way back from Towers drugstore at the time, apparently she was seen talking with somebody in supposedly a maroon vehicle.
She was on her bicycle speaking to someone, I believe, in a maroon sedan.
Apparently she got in the vehicle and left the area and was never heard from again.
Because of General Olenchuk's military status, the girl's disappearance brought a lot of attention to the area. Local police, military, and FBI forces began a widespread investigation. The search for Mary Catherine Olenchuk would affect the lives of many local residents, especially Bob Walsh, whose family owned a Kennebunk motel. Bob and his friends would frequently visit a barn on the Parsons estate near the motel. What felt like harmless fun soon caused Bob to become entangled in an unlikely chain of events that would change his life forever.
The barn that was on the Parsons estate was a spot where Starting the summer before in 1969, we had hung out. We had had parties up there. Some of the locals I know had parties in the area. A group of friends and I from the motel set out to go down to Parsons Beach. A friend of mine, Derek, and I had started fishing. Quite often we would keep our fishing gear right inside the barn. As we approached the barn to head back to the motel, we thought we had heard a rustling sound. We thought it was maybe a deer in the woods, which wouldn't have been an unusual thing to hear. There was nothing suspicious about anything. Derek and I dropped our fishing poles off and our tackle boxes and left them in the barn on the way back to the motel. We heard a car start off up in the distance towards the barn, and it came down to the end of Brown Street and just sort of stayed there for, seemed like a few minutes. We could see headlights shining across towards Parsons Beach. Finally, the car turned in our direction, and we skedaddled back over the garden and over the fence.
While Bob remained unaware of the gravity of his encounter that night, the rest of the townspeople rallied together and began a frantic search for the missing child.
I know that the area was on edge, and it was a frenzy of activity around here looking for this girl when she disappeared. We would see these Army helicopters buzzing around, and you knew what it was about.
I lived near Parsons Beach, and we were never allowed to walk or ride our bikes down there alone.
Anybody that had children especially, they went into lockdown, and we had a daughter 13, and I believe the other one was 10 at that time. And we watched them like a hawk because we didn't know what was going on. A girl had disappeared, and we didn't know if that was going to be, other people were going to be taken or what was happening. And the town was very tense.
I wouldn't let them go across the street to visit a friend. I wouldn't let them out of my sight. I was so afraid because nobody knew who had done it, a friend of theirs or a friend of ours, or no one knew. People weren't as open and neighborly as they were. Everybody, I think a lot of people suspected each other sometimes. They're like, well, maybe it's him or maybe it's him. But I think that was just a normal reaction.
Parents were much more aware that maybe it'd be a good idea to be a little more concerned about where their youngster was at any time of day, I think.
My father was a reserved policeman. I was no longer allowed to ride my bike.
Rumors began to swirl as the search for the missing child continued. One widespread theory involved Chase, a military operation that Mary's father was heavily involved in. In the volatile political climate of the early 70s, protest against this operation was inevitable. The idea of one of these protest groups taking the general's daughter seemed like a natural conclusion to jump to.
After the disappearance, it was indicated that her father was an army officer. There was some indication that he had been involved in some kind of mission that might have been controversial.
Operation Chase was an acronym for cut holes and sink 'em, and it was basically it's a military exercise or operation to dispose of outdated nerve gas weapons and also conventional weapons. The Major General was the head of this whole operation.
Though the motive was there, the Chase theories led to nothing but dead ends. Meanwhile, Bob Walsh, still unaware of his ties to the girl's location, continued to visit the barn on the Parsons estate. While picking up their fishing poles, Bob and his friends discovered dozens of dead birds on the barn's floor. It was later theorized that the killer escaped through a back entrance, allowing the birds to fly in but not to escape. Without knowing it, the eventual smell from the dead birds would help the murderer successfully cover their tracks. Still unaware of his connections to Mary Catherine Olenchuk, Bob continued to drift closer and closer to the truth.
I got home from lifeguarding that day. My father had asked that I help him clean one of the motel rooms that somebody had left early. When I got inside room 22, the room was freezing cold. And there's absolutely no reason for me to be For the room to be cold, it didn't have any air conditioning or anything. I just felt ill, and I sat down on the bed. I put my hand on the two-drawer dresser that was between the two beds, and that was cold. I remember looking in the drawer, and I picked up this Bible. This Bible was stone cold to the touch. I received a calling, if that's what you want to call it, to take this Bible up to the barn. I'm not a religious person. I'm not a person that you're going to be seen carrying a Bible around. And I left the motel room and quickly walked up to the barn with the Bible. Bad smell, still the dead birds all around. Couldn't have been there for more than a minute. And I went in and I put the Bible on this wagon that was stored inside the barn, and turned around and left. On my way back to the motel, I seemed to warm up. And I got back to the motel and I was feeling fine. As I've had time to think about this over the years, I think that one of the explanations is that there is this metaphysical connection sometimes when in the back of your head, maybe you're starting to figure something out.
The police searched the barn twice over the next few days. The first time based on advice from a psychic the Olenchuk family had hired to help locate Mary. After the police found no evidence, they checked the barn a second time after Bob had left the door open while placing the Bible inside. Both times they dismissed the signs of a decomposing body because of the smell of dead crows that littered the floor. A few days later, that same smell had finally gotten to Bob and his friends, who decided to remove the birds from their favorite hangout spot.
A girl that I had met at the motel had returned to the motel with her family. I remember Friday night we had talked about going to the beach early Saturday morning. We ended up starting from the motel, I believe it was around 5:30 in the morning, to walk to Parsons. It was a very, very cold night. I went and grabbed a couple of blankets from the utility room at the motel. We wrapped up in those, and we ended up getting a little further along than the first time, turned around because it was so cold, and headed back for the motel. So I had the brilliant idea. I said, well, you can't get back into your motel room. I said, I'm not going to be trying to get back into the house. So brilliant idea, why don't we just go to the barn and we can hide out up there for a couple hours. We went in the barn, we went up the ladder to the loft, and I know we were both cold, shivering, shaking. We were wrapped up in these two blankets, and we just sort of huddled together. I remember we were just sort of wrapped up in these blankets. There was a slight smell inside the barn, but it was very, very cold. So I think what had happened was the coldness of the night had calmed some of the smell down. At some point in time, we had fallen asleep. I remember waking up and I saw sunlight shining through the cracks in the barn roof. And I remember hearing cars. I have no idea what time it is. So we hastily made our way back to the motel. I left one of the blankets up in the loft. Melanie had one wrapped around her. So I took the blanket from her and I rolled it up and stuffed it in the tree branch, figuring that I would go back later and get it. So I hurriedly went in, got my lifeguard suit on, and Mom ended up driving me down to the beach.
Two friends from work asked me, well, where would be a good place to go have a picnic? And I said, well, go down to Parsons Beach and then later go back to that barn. They came back to me and they said, something really, really smells there. And they said, we didn't go in the barn. So I told my dad, I said, you've got to go back. You've got to go back to that barn. I think you need to see what's there. So he does go, and he gets the caretaker and several other policemen, and he finds the body.
Police Chief Frank Stevens, George Labarge, and a team of local police, state troopers, and Parsons Estate groundskeepers searched the barn for a third time. The absence of the crows removed any doubt about the source of the smell. George Labarge went beneath the floorboards and looked up to spot the remains of Mary Catherine Olenchuk from below. The girl could finally be put to rest, but the effects of the murder were just beginning.
My mother never showed to pick me up, so I started walking back from the beach to Route 9. When I got back to Route 9, a friend of mine spotted me, wanted to know if I needed to ride back. So I hopped in his car and we proceeded to head back down towards the motel. We got in front of the Riverhurst. I looked up through the field, and there were all these police cars covering the field. And it was that point that I connected what was going on. I knew that I needed to go. I had a sense that Frank Stevens would be there, and I knew that I needed to talk to him. I got out of Donnie's car and I started running up the field towards the barn. I was overwhelmed and I felt sort of stupid. Frank motioned for me to come, to walk towards him, and that I was all right. The one thing that I remember that afternoon is that I remember the medical examiners, Hurst, being there, and they were removing the body. Remember not being able to stop staring in the barn. And all I could say was, I said, well, we've been up here. Frank's first question was, how could you stand the smell? I just told him, I said it was really cold, and I had told him about Melanie and I being up there, and one of the stadies wanted to know, he says, well, is that your blanket that's up in the loft? And I said, yeah, I left it here this morning. And then he said, well, there was another blanket matching it that we found tucked in a tree down at the end of the path. And I said that would also be mine. And then they said they found a Bible in the barn, and I said that was also from the motel. I think they automatically thought that I had something to do with this. It was just so bizarre. Frank sent me back home and said that he and another state police detective would come down to talk to me. He just sent me home. As I finished walking my way back to the motel, I started realizing that I was in a little bit of trouble. Frank Stevens and I think it was Detective Bastion came down, started talking about basically that day, and tried to minimize the fact that Melanie and I had been up there. And when we had finished our discussion, the state police detective looked out front, and my father's 1964 Plymouth Fury that happened to be maroon was sitting out in front of the motel, and sure had wanted to pull the thing apart and check it. Dad was not impressed. He was not happy.
Across town, George Labarge struggled to process the day's events.
And my dad brought me in the room, and he gave me the biggest hug. And my sister, he gave us the biggest hug. And he kept saying, oh, Mary's hair looked like Jennifer's and looked like George Ann's hair. And he was a wreck. He was a wreck.
So I had suggested that I spend some time writing things down. I knew that there was a lot that needed to be said, and felt that maybe the timetable might actually help the investigation out a little bit. That afternoon, I had made the decision to go ahead and do this. So I spent all day Sunday retracing my steps. I could tell who had been with me, what days we had been up to the barn. I looked at my payroll card from the motel. Not only did I have the hours that I worked at the motel, but I also had what I had been doing for work. And I knew what my hours, and Frank Stevens knew what my hours were at the beach. So I put a very complete timeline together. He was reading this, and particularly, and I'm listening to his I'm listening to it and I'm going, well, this doesn't sound very good. He knew right off about that first night. It sounded to me like he was very troubled by that, and he thought that was probably the time that the girl was being brought to the barn. And he became concerned. He thought that perhaps my safety might be an issue. And I wrote this journal out. Frank read it. He gave it to the state police. They simply asked several days after that if I wouldn't mind going to Augusta and taking a polygraph to verify what I had written. I wasn't nervous from the standpoint of really being a suspect in the whole thing. But it is sort of nerve-wracking when you're directly asked if you kill somebody. That sort of got to me. The polygraph wasn't the problem. All people saw was state police car showing up, and I'm taken away in a police car. I went into school thinking that this had all ended and that there wouldn't be any problems.
The fact that his name was out there sort of surprised me. I thought, well, that makes sense that he would have been down and about that area, along with some of his friends all the time. Why in the heck is his name connected to this, or any 16-year-old's name, for that matter? Just didn't add up.
The main problem when school started was there were a couple of seniors and there were a couple of underclassmen. Several times I got things stuck in my locker, sort of disturbing little messages and notes. The one morning that I lost it was that somebody had, and I found out who had done this, but somebody had left a little rope hangman's noose jammed in my locker. And I remember that morning I had a very, very difficult time with that. And I did not like being thought of as being somebody who could kill somebody.
There was a lot of talk. That was the topic of who do you think did it? And of course, based on Bob Walsh's involvement and being in the barn, there was a lot of talk about, he had a nickname. It was Killer Bob. I never heard anybody say that to his face, but it was behind his back.
I'd start drinking. I'd go to school. Having had a couple of shots in the morning, I got into a bad place. And my teachers could see that I was in trouble, my principal. I had some supportive teachers that knew that I should be doing better than I was.
The strain on a kid of going through this rather horrific process must have been burdening, to say the least, and scary, to say the most.
I would struggle to concentrate on getting my schoolwork done, and I ended up starting to isolate myself. I continued working at the motel on the weekends, and aside from a few school activities, I pretty much kept to myself. My friends and my folks, and they could all see this, and there wasn't much anybody could do about it.
While Bob dealt with the aftermath of the unsolved murder, other people involved in the case were also haunted by the events.
I think when the murder did occur and he was out searching and everything else, I think probably in the back of his mind is like, it's not here. It's not in this. It's not here. She's not in our community. But I think the reality when it set in, it scared him right in his heart. My dad suffered for that, and I didn't like to see that haunting him. It was always like this little shadow over him. And he also would stress to other parents in the community, you've got to watch where your children are.
Bob Walsh continued to be plagued by the repercussions of the murder, beginning roughly a year later when the case was brought back into the spotlight.
The next September, this would have been in my start of my senior year, middle of September, was that my sister and I were in the living room at the motel watching TV. This older guy had stopped. I went out to meet him. And I remember him saying, he says, "Sonny," he says, "I don't want to alarm you, but I think your place is on fire." And I yelled at the folks. I looked up over the house. I thought part of the motel was on fire. It ended up being back a few hundred yards away at the barn.
For the majority of people, they felt that he did that he burnt it down. That it was too coincidental that it happened so close.
One of the guys had made a comment to me that he thought that I would be very happy that the barn is gone. Sort of insinuating that I might have had something to do with it.
People like to solve their own mysteries. They want to figure it out. They need to have an answer. So I think for a lot of people, not just in school but in the community, I think that they decided that no matter what, that it was Bob.
Over the years, the music became an important social part of my life. Being involved with different bands, getting back out and being in a successful social situation meant a lot to me. And over the years working rescue in Maine and Florida, I particularly remember the cases that involved the deaths of young children. When a child is lost, it's hard on everybody. I was in the restaurant business and catering business for a number of years. I worked as a paramedic in Maine and Florida. A lot of these things are coming to an end now. I'm concentrating right now on my job tutoring math.
I can't imagine how being wrongly accused has affected him. I can't imagine living in this community still for all of these years, knowing that under people's breath or behind your back, they're calling you Killer Bob, or they're saying, telling the next generation, that guy Bob, he's a suspect, and it must not be easy.
Bob really went above and beyond and became very involved in the community. He was on very many committees. He has put back so much into Kennebunk. I think that he was really trying to show people, I'm a good person. I'm invested in this community, and I want to help this community.
Maybe deep down, Bob has felt a need to sort of overcome all of that.
The final thought is that this is the final say in this. This is the final interview. And this is the final time that I'm going to be talking about this particular case.
Unsolved cases are like wounds that never heal or never scar over.
A young girl was taken away from her family, and that's the important thing to remember here.